In this episode, we have a special guest, David Cantrell, a distinguished member of the Slackware alumni. David's journey with Slackware spans back to the late 90s, where he served as a full-time core member between 1999 and 2001. During his tenure, David played an integral role in various facets of Slackware's development. From designing the iconic Slackware logo to co-developing the slackware.com website, his contributions have left an indelible mark on the community. Many of you seasoned Slackware users may even remember encountering David at one of the many Linux trade shows, or perhaps he responded to some of your technical support emails. And many of you may have read the Slackware Linux Essentials book that David co-authored along with another of the Slackware alumni, Chris Lumans. David's role covered a number of areas, from introducing essential-based packages into Slackware. He also authored AutoSlack, which was Slackware's first automated update tool. And he undertook the formidable task of porting Slackware to the SPARC architecture. In the process of porting Slackware to the SPARC architecture, he developed the Slackware package building tool, Proto-Package, that was used for the SPARC port, the Alpha port, S0390 and the PowerPC port. Now, for years, I've been meaning to connect with David. His SPARC port and the Proto-Package tool served as crucial references to me when I began porting Slackware to ARM back in the early 2000s. In this episode, we delve into David's fascinating journey from his initial foray into Linux and Slackware to his experiences over the past 2 decades at Red Hat. David's also the only person that I've ever spoken to who has software running in space. He had some software running on the NASA space station at one point, and when the systems on which David's software was running reached the end of their useful life, they were deorbited, and essentially his software was incinerated in the Earth's atmosphere, which I've got to say is a pretty cool ending to your software project. So without further ado, I bring you David Cantrell. Hello and welcome to the Slackware ARM vlog. With us today, we've got a special guest, David Cantrell. Hello, David.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. David is joining us because he used to work on Slackware back in the day in the early 2000s, and he's now part of the Slackware alumni. And David has some stories to tell. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've now got about 3 decades worth of experience working in the Linux ecosystem and open source ecosystem.
So I was actually asked that the other day, and I was thinking back to my first experience in the open source world, and like a lot of people, at least in the United States, my introduction was through a bookstore where we would get the large books. Someone had mentioned it at school, and that's how you would go and find this stuff. We didn't really have fast internet connections. That was about 1994 or 95. Is when I was first introduced to that world and started playing around with it. And then that just sort of progressed. And by 1998, I was actually receiving a paycheck to work on open source software, for a lack of a better term. And it was centered around the work on Slackware, because that's kind of where I first found all this stuff. What was the book? I think it was one of the Unleashed books, Slackware Unleashed. It was very thick and very heavy, but it was useful at the time because we didn't have really good information online that you could search. It was mostly all on Usenet, and you know someone who knows something, and then they point you at some notes that they wrote. So these books were useful, and they managed to give us all that sort of initial introduction if you had no experience with it before.
I had a similar experience myself with it. It was with the Burke CD-ROM where I got. Oh no, actually that was at university where I got Slackware from. But prior to that, it was a big. Actually, no, there was a Linux Emporium in the UK where they would download the images for you, and then you'd have the Red Hat or whatever. In my case,
right.
Red Hat first, and then installed it off that. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, in the 90s, the big business centered around open source software was, companies would download it, put it onto a CD, and then you could purchase it and they would send it to you in the mail. Because, that, like, otherwise, if you were not at university, you had dial-up at home, and you just could not download everything in a reasonable amount of time. And it was just more practical too, because oftentimes we didn't have enough storage space to hold it and then install it. So yeah, it was nice having that. Of course, Slackware was tied to Walnut Creak CD-ROM, and that was the main business of the company, was selling CDs with shareware, and the two big products were FreeBSD and Slackware Linux. But we also had CDs for everything. Basically anything that we could get, they would put on a CD and sell. There were, like 5,000 fonts or clip art collections or game, like here's a CD of DOS games, and just really anything like that could be turned into a collection and put on a CD, they would do it. And it was actually a really big business in the 90s.
Wow.
So yeah.
All right, so how did you get into, because I know you worked on Solaris boxes or Solaris Unix systems at some point. Was that kind of, how did you end up using Linux? Did they kind of collide or coexist at some point? Or
yeah, so my first introduction to Unix was on Sun equipment, and that was at the phone company where I lived. And my best friend in high school, his mother worked for the phone company, and we would be able to go down to the headquarters and work on school projects. She would let us use the computers and the equipment, because they had all really high-tech stuff, scanners, and we could just sit there, and then we would work on our school projects there. And she let us use really anything, and they had lots of PCs, and they had Sun systems. And of course I'm drawn to anything new that I hadn't experienced, and I was like, can I use this? And she said sure. And so I just started poking around with it, and I found it interesting. And then come to find out that that's not really a system that someone would have at home. It's not for that market. But I wanted to use something like that. And then that's when someone mentioned, well, have you heard of Linux? It gives you that kind of environment, but on a PC. And so that's how I sort of went down that path. So I kind of knew a little bit of Unix from a user perspective, and then found my way to Linux through those recommendations.
Oh, okay. Was Slackware the first one you used, or was it a different one?
Yes, and that was really not by choice. I had no idea that there were different distributions, and the person who recommended it to me, that was what they had used. And I said, well, okay, I guess this is what I get. Because if you have no idea what you're looking at, and you would go to the bookstore and you would see this whole aisle of, and you're like, I don't know which one. Do I get them all, or do I get one? So you're really guided by someone else who they're like, well, this is what I started with, so this is what you should use.
So you got that and you installed it and you set it up. What was that like? I mean, I remember when I first installed Slackware 3.5 after I'd been using Red Hat for a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, so the first install, that friend of mine whose mother worked at the phone company, we were determined to get Slackware installed. We went through the book, and we were going to figure out how to get this installed on, I think he had a Gateway 2000 PC or a compact PC or something, just sort of a average one. His was a Pentium, an early Pentium, and then I had a 486. That was really a 386 that pretended to be a 486. So we were going to use his system just because it was faster and had a larger hard drive or something like that. But as we went through it, we're sitting there like we have the book on the desk, and how do we make boot media? And so you had to create the boot floppies, and we couldn't boot the CD, and just figuring out each little step with a book as your only guidance, and not having anyone else there it was a lot of trial and error. It took us about a week before we finally got it running. And that was just getting to a text console. We're about halfway through the book now, and we're like, well, because I think Patrick was including the shareware version of Doom with Slackware, so the video game. So we ran that, but it didn't have sound, and that's when we learned, well, now you have to recompile the kernel. So that was like a whole other process, and we were just. I think my friend was getting a bit annoyed with it, but I found it fascinating because I was like, we're kind of tearing the system apart here and learning all of this stuff. So it was interesting. We never succeeded, at least on that system, we never succeeded in getting X working beyond 640 by 480. And that was X was tough back then. It was, it was really hard, and it was just so. Writing that config file with the mode lines for the display, and it's like you basically had to be an electrical engineer who had built the damn thing in order to write a config, because the mode line would have it was like a dozen fields, and they're all abbreviated. You're like, I don't know what any of these are,
Do you know what I used to do? I used to go I was determined to get X working on my Slackware box, so I'd because you had to know about the graphics card, and you had to know about the monitor. So I was used to looking at mode lines for a different RISC-OS operating system, how I got into ARM. So I was like, okay, well, so I have to look at the manual for the monitor in order to try and figure out the definition of the monitor. And then I realized that Red Hat actually had an X configuration tool. I can't remember what it was called, but it had one.
I remember, the X configurator, I think is what they called it.
Yeah, that would be it. So I'd install Red Hat on a different hard disk, and then get it to make a config, put it in Slackware, then have to change various different paths and various other things to make it work. That was how I approached it, because I gave up. I couldn't make a working X11 config by myself.
Yeah, I think in that case, it was just the monitor that my friend had was just, we had no information on it, and there was no like default mode lines we could find. But then the monitor that I had was just a standard run-of-the-mill display, and that one worked fine. So, we could pick it from a list, or I think we copied mode lines out of the book or something like that. But that was tough. It was. I think that was a part where I got kind of frustrated with, like, kind of thinking like, you know what, I don't really need X. I don't need the graphical interface. Maybe I'm fine with just the text mode stuff. But yeah.
God, yeah, I remember that well. And you had to know, you had to be careful with your monitor as well, didn't you? Because if you tried to run it in modes that it wouldn't support, you could actually damage it physically.
Yeah, I never had that happen, but I know people that did do that. They were trying to like drive a really high resolution or refresh rate, and some monitors had built-in circuitry, I think, to kind of prevent that kind of stuff. But cheaper monitors, like, I'll do what you tell me. And you tell it the wrong thing, and smoke comes out the top.
Oh yeah, I'm glad we don't have that problem anymore.
Oh gosh.
Looking at Slackware, it's a heck of a lot easier than it ever used to be, because everything, including X, just detects everything by itself in most cases.
Yeah, when X finally got to that sort of point, it was amazing, because I remember so much of the support questions we would answer trying to help people with Slackware was, how do I configure X? And it's like you were saying, you had to know the graphics card, because that determined what server you were going to use. And then, sometimes you didn't even have one that would work for them. It's like, well, can you emulate, a basic VGA card? Then you can use this server or something. But, there were the different, before the loadable drivers, there were the different servers. Like you had the one compiled for ATI, you had the one compiled for Matrox, you had all that stuff was different. And then you would have like I forget kind of the layout, but I just remember that it being, pick the server and then the display. Early on, when X gained the frame buffer driver, I remember what we had in Slackware. Patrick was really excited about this, where we just configured everything by default to run with the unaccelerated frame buffer driver, and it actually meant that you would install Slackware and X ran. It wasn't fast, but it worked for everyone, which I thought was really kind of cool. But of course, people complained. They're like, it's really slow. It's like, well, you can optimize it, you can configure it to work for your hardware, but at least you have the graphical interface out of the box.
You got it installed. How did you end up becoming involved with, well, you're not just involved, you're actually employed by, was it BSDi or Walnut Creak?
It was initially Walnut Creak CD-ROM, yeah.
Okay.
So that it's so strange. So I'm using this in high school, and then I get to university, and I have a computer science degree, so there were other Linux users, and we start helping each other. It's like, oh, hey, I can fix your sound card. Oh, I can fix your mode lines. Everyone kind of had like a different expertise. And one day, we used to have these trade shows called Comdex, and there's always some kind of industry trade show. Back then it was Comdex, and I think it was co-branded as Windows World as well, since Microsoft was a big sponsor. But that was just the trade show of the day. And one was happening in Chicago, like in the winter or something, like the worst time to go to Chicago. But a bunch of us were, I was in university in Atlanta, Georgia. So we were like, hey, let's just like skip out on a day and fly up to Chicago and go to this trade show. And I had been to trade shows before, industry shows. I'm like, yeah, you can get shirts, you can get free stuff, and then we're also like, yeah, we can go, see stuff in Chicago, right? So we go there, and we're just wandering around and collecting the freebies and stuff, and walk by, and we walk by the Walnut Creak CD-ROM table, and we see they have stacks of all these CDs out, and we're just kind of looking at it, and I was like, hey, look, there's Slackware, and that was what we were all running at the time. And I forget who was at the table, but he just looked up and he was like, oh, you guys use Slackware? And it's like, yeah. And it's like, well, here's the guy that made it. And Pat was sitting at the table as well in the booth, and we're like, oh my gosh, wow, like, yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks. This is, and so like chatted with him for a bit. And I remember talking about that story later on, like years later. He was like, yeah, so I was super sick when I was working that day, and I was exhausted. I had flown there. I had like some kind of stomach bug, and I was like, oh, really? I didn't even know. But yeah, he apparently wanted to be literally anywhere else except working at the trade show. And yeah, so after that, we just we started chatting over email, and I don't remember what led to it, but we were talking about putting together a Slackware website. There wasn't one. It was just the FTP site. And we're like, yeah, we're kind of talking it up here at the university, and there's no website for it. Would you be interested in us putting something like that together? And he just said, yeah, sure. And we did the site in my dorm room and made that logo in whatever version of the GIMP was in Slackware at the time, and showed it to him. And then I think that there was a push at Walnut Creak CD-ROM to increase the web presence. So we sort of produced this site, and then they asked him about it. He's like, "Oh no, I got a site. It's right here," and put it on Slackware.com, and that's how that came to be. And then Walnut Creak, as a thank you, flew us out for the Christmas party in San Francisco. And while we were on the boat in San Francisco Bay, they offered us jobs to move to California and work full time on Slackware.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize you would have made the website before actually being employed. Okay. Well,
We were just like, I mean, I think we were excited that we had something like Unix on our systems, and we were able to help people. And this was like one thing we were like, Slackware could use a site. I don't know why, like, I'm not a web person, but I guess we saw it as a need and a thing that we could contribute. And yeah, it just went from there.
Well, I think the website you developed has endured. It's probably the longest because I think it's still essentially the same website, David.
It is, yeah, and that's what's terrifying to me. Is that it is that same site we put together in like 98 or 99, I think.
I think I actually had to hack some of your Oh no, I think it was Perl script to add in the AH64 port links.
Yeah, it would all have been languages that I don't use now. But
I've got to say, when I looked at the code, I was surprised how I don't want to say over-engineered, but it was quite comprehensive.
Yeah, it was.
I was like, my goodness, well, I think you were expecting to have a lot more going on in the future. That was the impression
we were.
when I looked at the code.
Yeah, and we had. I don't think it's there anymore, but we had that discussion forum that people could post, and we would answer questions, and that we actually pulled in from a third party, the forum, PHORUM, and we integrated that into the site.
I remember using that. Yeah.
And that was like, we didn't have any mailing lists. We weren't hosting that, and we didn't really have an active Usenet presence. But I would say that was kind of like on the way out, and none of us were active on IRC. And we're like, well, we have this website. Why don't we do a web discussion forum? And I think back to all that now, and like, when we did that site, that was before you had like frameworks to do any of this kind of stuff. It was all like from scratch, and I would be terrified to see it now, see the code now.
Yeah.
It's got to be bad.
It wasn't bad actually. When I looked at it, I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, I have to edit it over here and I have to change this. And you kind of put there was various options for adding in additional ports and things like that in there. Okay.
Yeah, we were super ambitious about the future.
Well, yeah, it's still running. I can tell you, it is still actually running.
So the fact that that's in use and the logo is still the same, because like that to me was like how that just has lived on. It's wild to me, because there was no real thought into it. It was just like we needed an image that was unique, and we came up with that because we were able to pull the S out and use the S individually, and it would kind of
okay.
The S with the underbar became kind of like, it could be an icon, or it could be something in a smaller context and still look the same.
Is it actually an S from a font range, or is it a hand-drawn S? Do you remember?
Oh no, that's like the courier font that shipped, and we just used the text tool and made it gigantic, scaled it up. I mean, man, we played around with it, like
That's funny.
It's silly. Yeah.
The funny thing is, quite a few years ago, Patrick decided to redesign, or had somebody redesign the Slackware logo,
Mm,
and there was a quite a marked backlash against replacing the logo. Some people
really?
hated it. Yeah, it's still
Wow.
around, and you can buy a T-shirt of it. I think it's like it was called the Flippy logo. I wasn't a fan of it myself,
Hmm.
but your logo got restored quite promptly afterwards.
Wow. I can't. Yeah, it's so wild to me. Oh, I know the other thing was we needed a logo that did not include the penguin because it was overused at that point, and that was like
Ah, okay,
that's the kernel's thing. And so
that's true.
you if you looked at like a lot of different, especially a lot of different distributions that are not with us anymore, they all had like crammed a penguin in there somehow, and we're like, no, we have to have a
Mm.
unique logo. And oh yeah, the one that the first run of T-shirts that we got to wear. This was in '98 at the first Linux World Conference in Expo, where we were like the only booth selling shirts, as opposed to just giving them away. Actually, no, I think Slashdot was selling shirts as well. So we had these shirts, and it was done by the art department at Walnut Creak CD-ROM, who did. I mean, that was a busy team because they were doing all of the CD-ROM artwork, all the jackets, the inserts for the CDs, all that kind of stuff, and they were tasked. Slackware needs a shirt, make them one. So they basically took the free BSD shirt, which had remained largely unchanged. It was just a white T-shirt with BSDi on there, and I mean, it looked like an early '90s, freebie T-shirt, and they struck the FreeBSD and just wrote Slackware Linux, I think in blue maybe, and then they put the pipe smoking penguin in place of BSD, and I remember thinking, there's no way we can sell these. Like, no one's gonna buy this. I mean, it looked a little
Was that the one that
just
says got Slack on it, or was that a different?
that was a different run. That was after we had some input, but I'm talking about the very first
Okay.
ones that we had. But I shouldn't overthink it, because of course we sold them. People wanted really anything that said Linux, be it a shirt or a cup or a hat or something like that. So it was, I thought that it was gonna, backfire, and it was gonna be that like people would make fun of it or something, but no, we sold it. And then it got revised. I think the penguin with the pipe was more popular than I thought, and that remained around for a while, and was popular. We never got like a little plushie of it though, I don't think.
Oh, I used to have a I used to have a plushie tux actually. No, I left it somewhere. I had a single one. We just said it was from HP with about
Yeah,
the
yeah,
date
yeah,
event or something. Yeah, I lost that years ago. I still got my red fedora that's in over there actually in really good nick. But
yeah.
my plushie, I got that got lost. Who came up with the idea of a pipe smoking tux? I've
Well,
always
that's a reference to
oh, the Subgenius.
this. Yeah, the
Ah, okay.
and Jr. I'm gonna get it
Oh,
wrong.
Bob Dobbs,
Bob
isn't it?
Dobbs, yeah. Because he's like, that's that well-known image.
Yes, I remember now. So when you say we, it was you and Chris Lumans jointly
Yes,
work.
and Logan Johnson.
Okay.
So it was Logan. Logan and I were the ones who met Patrick in Chicago, and then we brought Chris in after that. So it became three of us that were working on it. And I forget how much time passed there. But yeah, it was initially Logan and I, and then Logan, Chris, and myself.
Well, how was the work divvied up? Was it just a case of whatever comes, pick it, or because
Pretty
it's
much, yeah. It wasn't really. There wasn't a lot of organization. We basically found a lot of things that needed doing and came up with our own priorities. Walnut Creak, the primary things that they were interested in were marketing and sales. So they would travel us to the trade shows and conventions, and we would carry the material with us. And so they were on that angle. They really didn't care a lot about the technical stuff. It was,
okay?
you guys do whatever you want to do. We're just make this many releases, on this timetable so we can make new CDs and sell them.
Okay. Well, how many releases were they sort of planned per year, more or less? Do you remember?
I think the aim was 2 per year. Oh. 7, doing 7 took longer. And there was like,
when you say 7, do you mean Slackware version 7?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Because at the same time, so let's see, we had the 3 series, and there was a 4.0.
Yeah.
And then we jumped to 7. And that was also largely marketing driven, where we would have people come up at a trade show to the booth and they would say, "You only have Linux 4. When are you going to move to Linux 5?" Referring to Red Hat Linux 5. And we're like, come on, guys, you don't even know what you're talking about here. And it got really annoying. And I think I remember saying, like, or Patrick saying, like, well, we'll just jump past them. We'll just go to 7, and so
because the kernel was like Linux 2.0 at that point, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. But we also, so Patrick did he did one final release of the 3 series, 3.9 at the same time, and there was 4.0.
Okay.
Because 4.0 was that the glibc one?
I think it might.
I think it was, because
8.out to ELF. Is it perhaps that was the?
No, that was 3.0.
Oh,
that was the ELF switchover. Which that was also marketed as Slackware 96, I think, because it was around the time of Windows 95, and so you put the year on these.
Oh right, that's what
yeah,
that
was. I think Patrick was overruled on that. He was like, "No, I don't want to do it," and that was before any of us had joined in. But I want to say like 4 was glibc, and then 3.9 was 4, but still with libc 5. Or is it the kernel that I'm thinking of? Because we went 2.0 to 2.2. Maybe that. Oh, you know what? That was the 3.9 and 4 split. Is because they were, both of those were libc 5, and you had 4 that had the 2.0 kernel, and then you had 2.2, and then you had 3.9 with the 2.0 kernel for the people that wanted to stay on that. I think.
It's funny you say this, because it's been so long since I used that stuff, and I'm now remembering that there was always different variations, because not everything worked that well, and there wasn't that much continuity or consistency or mature. Well, certainly wasn't any maturity, that's for sure.
It was.
Okay.
So I remember the shift to the 2.2 kernel was was a big deal because the kernel changed a lot of stuff, and a lot of people wanted to stay on 2.0 because certain things weren't like change. Like, every new major version of the kernel seems to reinvent firewalling, so that was all different. And yeah, now it makes sense that 7 would have been the glibc change, because we couldn't have done a concurrent libc5 and glibc release. And Slackware was one of the last major distributions to move over to glibc, and that was, I mean, I honestly don't really care. Like, the C library, just that has to work, that has to drive the system. But around that time, there were a lot of companies that were building commercial software, non-open source software to run on Linux. And if you remember, glibc was available as a runtime library in, I believe, Slackware 4. We may have even had it in like 3.6 or something, but the system wasn't built against that. And the reason that was there is so you could run some of that commercial software or games that were linked against glibc, but we weren't a glibc system at the time.
Ah, right. Okay. I didn't know that. That was before my time. I do remember seeing lots of different variations of Slackware, all components you could add in, and it's not like that anymore. It hasn't been for quite some time. You've each got your own priorities. You were looking after.
We were working on basically the community. That's where we came up with the idea for the discussion forum, and that's we set up like general email addresses, like support@slackware.com. It's like, you have a question, just email us. And we would take turns just answering email. It got like an ungodly amount of email, but we were like, this is the stuff that's missing, and let's try to help the users. Let's try to hear back from people. We never set up a bug reporting tool. In retrospect, I wish we had, because it was clearly things were found, but everything was in Patrick's head, basically, or written down, by him, and that's kind of how we tracked stuff. And he would communicate out changes through the changelog, which I think he still does.
He still does.
Yeah. But yeah, it may have been helpful to have like a bug reporting tool. Of course, you get a lot of noise with that, but you do have a way to if 100 people are reporting this particular problem, maybe it's a little more urgent than we thought, and stuff like that. We did Chris and Logan and I. Chris was in charge of it. The book, the Slackware Linux Essentials book, we wrote that. Which prior to that, they were shipping the Matt Welsh book, which was way outdated, from 94 maybe. And it was like, I don't know how they had the ability to keep printing that and including it with Slackware in the box, but that's what they were doing. And it was bad because it wasn't even a Slackware book. It was just like generic, and the information in it didn't even really apply anymore. So we were tasked with writing a new book. FreeBSD had just rewritten the handbook, the FreeBSD handbook. So we were modeling after that idea, and and wrote that and got it published. That was hard.
I was going to say, that's writing. I mean, I've done one for myself for a different project, and that's a serious amount of like mental work.
Oh yeah.
Like just figuring out how to structure it.
Yep. Yeah, and we went through so many different ideas. Like, do we do it concept based? Is it just, do we like list out commands and describe things? Do we do a mix of both? It was it was a lot of planning and rethinking how it's going to come together. The hardest part actually was the index for the book, which we had to use SGML tools. We had to write the thing in SGML, and
Yes.
that was just the thing of the day, and a horrible markup language, and it had no, there was no like indexing tools or anything. And Patrick was like, you guys have to have an index. Walnut Creek CD-ROM, like you have to have an index. And I remember asking the FreeBSD guys, what did you guys do for the index? And they just laughed. They're like, oh yeah, we didn't make one. There wasn't a way to do it. I'm like, okay. So I think it was mostly Logan who wrote some Perl to generate an index for us. And that's how the book got one. Yeah, that was tough. And then you had to verify that it was correct, which was manual. Like we actually went through the index. We're like, okay, that is on that page. Yep, that's on that page.
In fact, one of the first packages I built for the ARM port was a Linux DocTools package, which was a replication of the SGML-tools package that you'd built for Slackware, which actually, when I looked at it, was an unpacking of RPMs.
Yeah, because there was like no release of that stuff anywhere. Like it was just like files. You had to go and collect them all. So yeah, we did that. That was irritating.
Yes, I looked at it. I was like, so how do I build this? Oh, you just okay. So
yeah.
I had to go and figure out how to build it all from Linux from scratch, from RPM spec files, and then an SGML tools had been superseded by Linux DocTools at that point. So I was like, okay, let me redo this whole thing. Because otherwise you can't build stuff if you don't, or you have to hack out all the make files so that it doesn't build the documentation.
Yeah, no, it's a cascading failure at that point.
Yeah, that's right. And so I gave it to Patrick. Look, I built this for the ARM port. You might want to upgrade the one in Slackware, and eventually he incorporated it. I didn't realize that you were actually working at Red Hat when I was at the same time.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So I was there in the UK office. I was using these in corporate IT with these. We had access to all of the laptops. That there was new machines waiting to be given out to employees or whatever. So I just repurposed them, installed Slackware on them, and was building the Linux DocTools package on there.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah, that's the way it was. That was it. Yeah, I didn't have a spare machines. There's no VMs at that point, so I needed disposable hardware. So I just used those.
Hey, that works. I'm surprised someone hasn't come up with a distribution build system using GitHub Actions. So if you you can trigger GitHub Actions and then it runs in a VM somewhere. So what if you had your source tree for your distribution and Git, and you update a package and it goes in and just rebuilds it and then automatically publishes it, and you're using GitHub Actions resources to do all that. You have no build farm of your own. You're just doing it that way. I don't know if anyone's done that yet.
I'm sure someone's thought of it. I was talking to a friend recently who was talking about it's more of a CI/CD process with it, but I don't know. Where would we got to? Okay, so
I was mentioning the book and then and other things. So we obviously we're migrating into other things, and we're helping with packages and fixing bugs and stuff like that. And Patrick is largely doing all of that himself. And I get it, that you have your process to do this, and there's no, to my knowledge, they still don't have this. There was no source control or anything. It was just a directory, and he just copies it around, which is unfortunate because there's so much history there that could have been captured over the decades. But whatever. So we started talking about one thing we did early on was add HTTP and FTP network install support to the Color GZ install disk. And so we added that in, but I don't think he was a fan of the implementation. It was a little shaky. It assumed a lot of stuff, but it was kind of like, here, we've made this like proof of concept, and so I think we tested it out for a while, but ultimately, decided, we don't really want that. We were looking at ways to improve the packaging system. Obviously, dependencies were oftentimes brought up by people, and I like so one of my projects at work, I do have a GitHub action that tests that it builds on Slackware, because I test like a bunch of distributions, and Slackware is hands down the toughest one to get the build environment set up, because one, it doesn't come with a lot of stuff that I have come to expect from other systems. That was kind of surprising. I mean, it comes with a lot of stuff, but there's a lot that's missing. And then the lack of dependencies, like it has, basically, if you don't do a full install, you have to manually know the stuff. And I remember playing that game at Slackware, but when you're trying to set up a system for development or testing purposes, it's annoying. And so we were always trying to brainstorm on how we can better do that in sort of a Slackware way. We didn't really arrive at anything, but how do you maintain a simple system, but maybe give a little more help, at least with shared library dependencies. And maybe there's something that could be done there that wouldn't annoy people. I have no idea. But we did talk about like different build systems. So I did the proto package thing, which was meant to be an improvement to the sort of random script / notes method of, I'm going to build and then here's how I package it up. And some things are really simple, most things are really complicated. At that point in time, the way Slackware was built he would just blast it across the system, and then seriously, like that. That's yeah, and it's dangerous, and I mean, obviously, but there's also, that's like the surefire way to ensure that you are getting the actual install that you want. You don't have munged paths, or it's exactly where it's going to be installed on the target system. So the harder part is figuring out what has been installed. And so we had the before install and after install scripts, which would basically just diff the file system, and then pick up packages, like package things that way. Lots of reinstalling to like reset the system. No use of like chroot jails or anything like that. So it was a manual process. So I was looking at how can we make that a little more predictable, and that's where I came up with the proto package idea. Just so that we're still building that same way, but it's less like bespoke process and knowledge and stuff like that. We used proto package on the ports, and I think Patrick was considering that for the main system, because he saw it working on the ports, so we were thinking about that. We did. Oh, I wrote Auto Slack, which was one of those keep your system up to date, like track current. And I think that's been re-implemented at least 2 or 3 dozen times by other users. And yeah, I found the code for it. I also found the code for proto package and another one that we tried and ditched called SPS, the Slackware packaging system. Found that.
You found those on your DVDs?
I did, and I
Ah,
still I've found the alpha port work, the PPC port work. I found two SPARC binary trees, but no source. And I came across those source repos for the projects I just mentioned. There's a couple more boxes I need to dig through, but I can hopefully I can round it all up.
one of the reasons I came into contact with your work originally, apart from the fact that you've been working for Slackware, was because I was using your SPARC port as a reference for the original ARM port. Because, as
Mhm.
you were saying, there weren't, when people, if people are reasonably, well, I should say, anybody who watches this who wasn't using Slackware or looking in the source tree 22 years ago
Mhm.
has got no idea about what it was actually like back then. And in some cases, there were no build scripts
It's true, yeah.
at all,
Um,
or
I
they were like you say, it was a like zlib.build, and it literally compiled it and just splattered it in make installed over the file system, and there was no way of capturing what it did, or there was just no script at all. So I would go, well, how am I supposed to build this? And I looked in the SPARC port, found everything, found the proto packages. I was like, oh, okay, so this must be how it's supposed to be built because it's the official SPARC port. So I assumed that that's it, and I would just, in some cases, I just copy what you had and just put it into my own um, build script. But although by that point Patrick had kind of settled on his Slack build formats, although they weren't, well, yeah, he'd settled on that, but they were basically partly. I mean, part of it was because back in the day there was no, dest-dir support in makefiles, so they
right.
were just there was no
Yeah.
way of. I mean, there just wasn't. So you either had to
Yeah.
know in advance what the list was, and then that meant tracking it between versions, or you basically had to install it in the file system. And so
Yeah.
yes, so I used that. I used your proto package scripts as basically the only reference that I had that worked.
Yeah. Well, and that was the idea too, that we kept showing Patrick. We were like, we can have, you should be able to take this and build it on Intel, and it should work as well. That was a goal, so that we would be, we could have like a single source tree ultimately. Um, but yeah, never got there.
No, this still isn't. But when you started working on the SPARC port, how did you go about doing that? Did you bootstrap it off of Solaris, or did you cross compile it on x86? How did you? Because it really depends on where you're coming from as to
Yeah,
what you.
so I didn't do cross compiling. I think what I used was either Red Hat or Debian in a very minimal,
Okay.
very minimal installed system, and immediately started trashing that with rebuilds. Because like, how deep do you want to go with ports really?
Yeah.
People get kind of squirrely about like, oh well, you built this compiler with some other vendor's compiler, so it's not clean. And it's like, yes, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a compiler. It's like, what we're really concerned about is having the system look and function like, Slackware on
Yeah.
other, on Intel. So I. I'm pretty sure that's what I did. I just installed like the bare minimum to start building stuff. Figuring out the build dependency order was also a trick, um, which I mean
Yeah.
that's always a problem. But we didn't have any way to specify build requirements. Like Slackware
No.
didn't do that. The assumption is you're building on a full install. Um, which, okay, but where do I start?
No, I had exactly the same thing. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was. Yeah, it depends on what you've got, what your existing base is, as to what you need.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Yes, I remember that well. And also in Slackware, even when I got to it, some of the build scripts assumed that, well, in fact, you couldn't build certain packages unless you already had that package installed,
Hmm.
because it would rely on something in the build script. And well, hold on a minute. So if I don't have this package, I can't actually build it anyway.
Yeah.
And had to work around all of those types of things, because Slackware wasn't. This was, I mean, building Linux distributions from source was not a thing. back then. Linux from scratch didn't exist.
No, it didn't. Yeah.
It was just hacking things together to make it work. I remember and seeing what other people had done in their RPM spec files and Debian rules and all that kind of stuff.
And looking, yeah, and lots of repeating what you had done because you got a little further and you're like, oh, I should have done this back here. Let me go start over. I had all those notebooks as well, where I kept notes as I went through everything, building it. And back then like GCC wasn't that great back then. And I think when I was starting the port, we were on 2723 was the main compiler we had. I don't think we were at 295 yet, which no one wants that. But we like getting that to work on SPARC was a trick too, because there was a lot of fixes that Red Hat had done that were not, part of GCC, and we also had you had the Cygnus sort of separate fork, the eggs EGCS. You remember that?
I think so. Is that the one where Red Hat did a release of a compiler that was never released?
Yes, and the story behind that was it was not an engineering decision. It was a mistake that something somewhere was done, and they had no choice but to use that compiler. I think like the release dates or something were changed, but the assumption was they were still working on rawhide builds with that, and there was gonna be a coming compiler release, but so
okay. I see.
But that got shipped to the world. It was labeled as GCC 296, which will forever haunt Red Hat. But Red Hat ended up buying Cygnus, as you know, and EGCS basically became the upstream for GCC, which is where it continues today.
So when you were building the SPARC port, did you basically, did you have any way of orchestrating did you have a build list, or did you kind of build it? Because this is how I think Patrick used to do it, was you build it, wait for it to compile, see what happened, and then just do the next thing. And then if you were, for example, you go to build the latest package of whatever, and then by the time it's running, it's like 25 minutes later, or maybe 40 minutes later, the configure script says, it's too old. Version of whatever is too old, dependency. So then you have to go and build that one, and you end up chasing dependencies.
Yes.
So this is how I did it for ARM, and it drove me nuts. So in the end, I automated it all, and Patrick was telling me, well, I asked him how you built certain, I think it was GCC or something like that, and he said, I just rebuild it over and over and over, and I was like, sounds like a good idea. So I wrote a script that just basically rebuilds everything over and over and over, so I could walk away, come back, and hopefully by 2 days later, it had just hammered itself against the wall and see what stick.
Yeah, see, what's falling out now, and then go and fix that. Yeah, and initially it was that manual process. So it was, go and so I started the work on an Ultra 5. Sun was running a special.
They're very slow Ultra 5s, though, aren't they? I had one.
Well, the Ultra 5 was garbage. I'll talk about that in a minute, but the Sun was running a special where you could buy a brand new Ultra 5 direct from Sun for like $2,000 or something. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I can buy a new Ultra SPARC for like what a PC costs. So I bought one. And it being Sun, they wanted to ship it by like semi truck and white glove service, and I was like, no, I'm gonna come and pick it up. So I drove to wherever the fulfillment center was, I think Fremont, California, and picked it up and brought it home, and now I have this Ultra 5. And of course, I thought it was fast. It was certainly faster than the SPARC stations I had, and it was 64-bit, which was
Yes.
interesting. So that's what I was using, but SPARC processors are not known for their screaming speed. It's all about concurrent users on that platform. So when you get a multi-processor SPARC system, or more RAM, the objective is to handle more concurrent users or processes, not to run one thing really fast. So
Oh, okay.
yeah. So the joke was always like, anytime you would upgrade a Sun machine, you're like, yeah, it's about the same. It was like, it's never really faster. So I ended up, Sun actually became interested in the port, and they were wanting to, get their name attached to Linux in more ways than one. So they loaned me hardware. They they wanted to send me an Ultra 10, and I was like, well, I already have an Ultra 5, and they're like, well, this is an Ultra 10. I was like, yeah, it's the same board. It's just vertical instead of horizontal. And the guy was like, oh, okay, so you've opened it. And so he was like, what do you want? I was like, I'd like an Ultra 60 or better. And he was like, ooh, that's a tall order. I was like, well, I'm telling you, you asked me, what would work. And he's like, let me see what I can do. And got me a dual processor. I think it was 400 megahertz processors or 450s. I can't remember. 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. I do remember that. And then dual 36 gig SCSI drives and the Creator 3D frame buffer. And the most exciting part was they gave me a 21-inch Sun CRT monitor to go with it, which weighed as much as 10,000 suns. It was the heaviest thing in the world. Like, I put it on my desk and the desk sagged,
I know what you mean, because a guy from university gave me a Sun monitor when he gave me a SPARC Station 20 and a VT320. And I wasn't exactly the strongest kid at university, but I could barely carry it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And now, like, no one getting into this stuff now will ever have to move one of those displays again. I'm happy we don't have to deal with those anymore. But so I got that Ultra 60 and I moved over to it being the main compile system, and it was faster, but it was still, like, building X took more than 24 hours. Anything was C++, so we had KDE, and we were building Mozilla at that point, which had been open sourced. So these were all C++ code bases, which was even slower to build. Like, it took days to build KDE. But we would do this on Alpha and on SPARC and on Power. We would set like a big compile and then, go out to eat or whatever, or go watch a movie or something, and then come back and check on it, because we couldn't parallelize stuff. We were still in that sort of like discovery phase of what do each of these things need on the different ports. You really had to wait for it to fail and then pick it up from there. So that was really time consuming. But once everything was done, I think I could have set up just a constant rebuilder script. So change anything in the tree and it just triggers a rebuild, because by then I knew the build dependency order. Even though that's not really static, but it was, I could have started with that at least. But yeah, it was slow going.
Yeah, I know it well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's concurrent processes. I mean, this is where it worked really well in the 90s for web hosting and stuff, where you have a lot of concurrent processes for connected users.
Yeah.
So it could handle a bunch of those, but none of those are really compute intensive. So, but yeah, on the Ultra 5, so that thing, that was basically a PC that they put
Yeah.
an UltraSpark on. So it came with an ATAPI.
You see, it didn't have an IDE drive. Yeah, I remember mine.
Yeah, an ID hard drive, but it also had the known bad CMD 646 ATA controller.
Yes.
Uh, which it was
CMD.
it had known bugs in it, and they used it still. It had that onboard crystal semiconductor sound, that 16-bit sound. It did have Sun Happy Meal Ethernet. It had the HME 100 base T.
HME, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So what I ended up doing was I bought a SCSI host adapter, PCI, and switched out the IDE junk for SCSI.
I had an external SCSI drive.
Yeah, that ended up that helped things a lot, because so especially in Linux did not know how to work around those bugs in that IDE controller. So you'd be doing stuff and all of a sudden it would just like lock up, You're like, man, this thing again. But they worked around it in software in Solaris. They're like, oh right, yeah. So yeah, that system was garbage. And the one that I got, because they were running that special on it, it was an UltraSpark 2i, 360 megahertz, but it only had like 256K of cache, and most of the UltraSparks had like 1 or 2 megabytes of cache. So I also ended up swapping out the processor later on with the different UltraSpark modules.
I see you had quite a few machines then. Was this partly because you just needed faster machines for building, but also were you trying to support a different range of those machines? Was that the intention?
Yeah. So I had Sun 4M hardware, so I had some SPARCstation 20s, and I had SPARCstation. I had some 5s, which I think is also Sun 4M. I had a lot of Sun 4C equipment, so SPARCstation 1, 2, 1
I
Plus.
thought the SPARCstation 20 had a 68K processor in it. I thought it. Oh, okay.
No.
Mistake. I had one. I must have been mistaken. It was really slow though. That thing. I didn't even.
It was a 32-bit machine. I think it was like 20 megahertz, but it was a 32-bit. Yeah, and then I had a Java station. I actually got Slackware SPARC to boot on that, which was also a PC that had a SPARC. A SPARC processor in it, because it was VGA and PS2 for the keyboard, and it had no local storage, so everything had to be
the NFS
wire.
Okay.
Yeah. And that thing was super slow. Like whoever came up with the idea, first off, back then Java was extremely slow, and then they came up with this mega slow computer to run it on. But yeah, I had as many different variants that users were typically going to have. Probably the most common thing that users had that they wanted to run Slackware on was a Sun 4C system, so a SPARCstation 1 or 2. So unfortunately, those were by then those were showing their age even, and I think I eventually had to drop support for those things because they just didn't. So SPARCstation 1 was 1989, with a 20 megahertz processor.
I had a couple of Sun's Ultra 2s with the Creator 3D. I had 2 of those actually.
So the Ultra 2 and Ultra 1 were nice systems. Those were the first UltraSparks. I think I had an Ultra 1 for testing, but I had the 5 and the 60, even though, so the 5 was a PCI bus and the 60 I think was still S bus. But then that was the thing with the one and the 2, Ultra 1 and Ultra 2 were not PCI, they were S bus based, so it would have been helpful from a hardware perspective to have more coverage. But eventually you run out of space to store all this junk.
Where do you have it? Was it in Walnut Creek's offices or?
No, it was at my apartment.
Oh right, so you had all of this you had all this stuff humming away.
We didn't work in their office at all. There was no space, so the Slackware and the FreeBSD people worked out of their houses or apartments.
So how did you guys work together then with Patrick and Chris and Logan? Did you kind of meet up somewhere?
Yeah, we would meet on occasion. We were chatting, constantly, and so we had servers at the office, so we would, everything was like centralized there. But yeah, we would go over to Patrick's. He actually had a house. We'd go over to his house. Chris and Logan and I were roommates. We shared an apartment, so it was easy. Like we were in the same space anyway. And yeah, we had.
I'm thinking, David, of the noise of all of these Sun machines. They have a very particular noise as well, like the humming.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of like the hard drives of SCSI drive spinning.
Oh, that place was super noisy. There's no way I would be able to pull that off now at my house. Way too much noise.
Must have been fun though back then doing all of that. I remember when I was doing my ARM stuff, and I had loads of ARM machines in an apartment, and it made a lot of noise because they weren't the embedded machines you have these days. They were full sized PCs basically with strong ARM processors in them.
Yeah, it was it was definitely fun. It was exciting to work on another architecture and kind of expand what we were supporting. And in that time period too, with so the early 2000s, I guess late 90s, early 2000s, you had more and more people being introduced to Linux for the first time. It's growing in popularity, and that led a lot of people to they're like, well, what about these commercial Unix systems that look similar? I bet I could use that. I bet I know what I'm doing there. So people would pick these things up used, have no OS for it, or not know where to find it. So they're like, well, maybe I can put Linux on it. So there was a desire to have an OS for hardware that's getting discarded. And yeah, so Linux was like an obvious choice for people.
I was going to ask you, because I was thinking if you'd spent all this money, or somebody had spent all this money on a Sun, you probably would keep Solaris on it rather than put Linux on it. Just
right, yeah. At the time, yeah. So it wasn't companies; it was all hobbyists.
Okay.
The same with Power. Really, it was only PowerPC, so it was like Macs. So those are.
Okay.
Those are going to like home users or what. No business was out there buying a Mac to run Linux.
Right. No. Okay. Now it makes sense. Okay.
Alpha was a little different because there were so much fewer of those, because it hadn't really hit the market the same way, and there wasn't really a central or main operating system for it. Like even DEC couldn't agree on what it should be. So you had Windows NT, which could run on it. You had at least 2 different commercial Unix variants for it. And then at Digital here in New England, John Mad Dog Hall worked there, and he pushed for the company to let people port Linux to it, and got hardware sent to core developers. So in the 90s, the Alpha became like a top contender with Linux, and it actually saw some commercial use, like Digital Domain, the special effects company that James Cameron co-owns or co-founded or something like that. I'll never forget this, but the first movie with Linux rendered special effects was Titanic from 1997.
Oh, was it?
And that was rendered on DEC alphas running Red Hat Linux.
Oh wow, I didn't know.
And Chris Lumens has one of those computers at his house.
Does he? He's managed to keep one. Have you still got any of the Suns you acquired for Slackware? Or do you have
Sadly, no. Those have all been. I kept the Ultra 5 for a long time. That was my personal system. The Ultra 60 had to go back to Sun, and the other ones, trade, sell, discard over time. Once I wasn't doing the SPARC port, there was no reason for me to have them all running, so they just were taking up space. And I think I eventually got tired of moving them.
The problem is I had loads of Unix boxes. And I regret in a way throwing them away, because now I've got my own house. I could have kept them here. You literally can't move apartment and houses with these massively heavy, enormous things that you can't realistically turn on, because they're also quite power hungry.
Oh yeah, and I think I was talking to someone one time who was saying, well, you could have just gotten like a storage locker somewhere. And I was like, you got to understand, at that time in my life, I didn't have money to throw away on storing but yeah, I wish I had kept more of that. I do actually have quite a range of hardware. I still have an SGI-02 that works. I had a lot of SGI stuff, and most of that got sold. There was I remember in the early 2000s, or I was really active in these SGI news groups, just answering questions and helping people and stuff. And people started asking me, they're like, hey, can I buy this? I need it for my company. And SGI, went belly up, and people were paying top dollar for this hardware. So of the hardware that I collected, I actually ended up making money on the SGI stuff.
Well, they were buying spare parts or something, or
one guy in Scotland, I want to say, paid me a ton of money for Crimson parts, SGI Crimson parts, because he had a customer who needed it, and that system hadn't been manufactured since 1990 or something. I was like, sure. I mean, this is going to cost a ton to show. He's like, I'll pay. So, okay, cool.
The old Unix parts emporium.
yeah, and then of course, you make money on one of those things. It's just sort of a chance encounter, and then you start thinking I could make a living this way, and it's like, no, you can't. No, you're just going to end up with a pile of junk that no one wants.
It's going to be on eBay forever.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh wow, that's funny. Red Hat bought this company years ago. It was something to do with hardening Apache, and they had all these machines in the UK the Red Hat UK office, the original one, and one of which was an alpha, and there were various other Suns and other machines on which they maintained the support for this thing. So eventually, once they either merged it into Apache or discarded it or whatever they did with it, these machines were surplus to requirements. And one of them was a DEC alpha. In fact, there was two of them, a big tall one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't big at all. It's quite squat, but it was quite large. And the other was a smaller alpha. And I posted the alpha to a guy in Germany who'd taken on Chris Lumens' alpha port and maintain. He's like, oh, I've got this alpha. So I've got one. No one wants it anymore. Do you want it? So I posted it to him from Red Hat office.
Yeah.
But it's funny, you said about a PowerPC port, and I also asked Patrick, and he said he doesn't remember one. So I don't know whether it never got completed or
no, it didn't get completed. So Logan was working on that, and the only ones that we completed and had pressed CDs for and actually demoed at a Linux World were the SPARC and Alpha ports. PowerPC was pretty far behind. One of the issues with PowerPC that we still run into today is just sort of the weird nature of how it boots. And back then, so Apple Apple still has this problem, but they had this issue where basically every machine was built from the ground up by one team, and so you would figure out something on one system and it wouldn't necessarily apply to another. And this is at the boot level, like before the OS is even there. So I remember the PPC port just being sort of struggling because of all the ports, it needed a wider variety of hardware, which we didn't have, because unlike SPARC, which is, you go dumpster diving for, Power was being sold in stores at the time by Apple. So all that stuff had value. So it was way more expensive to come by. Ironically, it's the one that more people wanted to try because they would have those systems, whereas SPARC, it would have to be like, here is a sysadmin for some company and he took one home kind of thing.
That's how mine came from.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's very similar with ARM, where there's a fragmentation at the boot with the bootloaders. Things. It's crazy. So you managed to get the Slackware installer working for SPARC, didn't you?
Correct. Yes.
So that's funny because I don't recall seeing any of either I missed it or it had gone off the FTP site by the time I was looking for it. But I had to re-implement the whole thing myself for ARM because it was all Patrick had just built it by hand. So did you?
I modified the scripts from Intel. So there was no so that was the thing. There was no source tree of the setup program, the installer. It was crammed in color.gz as a bunch of scripts. So that would have been the only place it would have lived. And yeah, but I took that as the framework and I just used his and modified it where I needed to for SPARC. Because I also wanted there to be, one source copy for the installer. So, I was trying to make patches that could be incorporated back into that same thing. So we wouldn't have to have independent source trees. Obviously some things didn't apply, like Lilo config, the set up the bootloader thing on Intel. I had to, that was all different because on SPARC it was Silo.
So, yeah, that's it. Yeah, Silo.
So like things like that, I had to create that stuff from scratch.
Yeah, I was asking because I remember looking at it and Patrick said, well, there isn't a build script for it. I just unpack it, change what I want, and it was a loopback image, I think, at the time.
Yep.
So I thought, okay. So basically I've got to then figure out where all these binaries come from and then compile them all for ARM, replace them all, and then start working on the actual installer parts for ARM and strip any of the x86 bits.
Yeah.
So I remember going through and then looking at, well, where does this binary come from? This isn't the same version. Oh, it's from file utils, and we're already using core utils. Okay, so I need to go and find Debian that had a really old version of file utils, and then compile that. Apply. So there was still, it still worked. Oh God. Okay, so you must have done all of that work as well, but I didn't see any of the. Maybe you did that manually or something.
I did. Yeah, and it was all the notes were written down in one of my notebooks. I did have some helper scripts for me to, like, I think I had a script that would go and build all of the executables that needed to be in the setup image, and would like construct the loopback image, and figuring out bootable CDs on SPARC was a trick. That was totally different than Intel was, because Intel had the El Torito, where it emulates a floppy drive or a floppy diskette and just boots that way through BIOS. SPARC didn't have any of that, so you had to construct the CD with a Sun disk label, basically, and do the slices that way, and then you would put the kernel at the beginning, follow and trail that with the color.gz, and then you could boot from the open firmware prompt. You could the goal was to be able to type boot cd, and it would load. PowerPC was similar because it was also open firmware, but a little different. And then Alpha had two different firmwares. You could either have Alpha BIOS or you could have SRM, and the process to boot those was completely different. So, yeah.
How did you keep the ports updated? Was it that Patrick was pushing out x86 first and you consumed that, and then
the goal there was to at least do the versioned releases at roughly the same time. So we were tracking current, doing the ports. So we would pick up the new things, and then the ports would rebuild them. The ultimate goal there was that, we would get to a point where you update a package, but you update it on every platform. So initially it was just a lot of catch-up work, so we would be weeks behind, but this is in the, the bootstrapping phase. And then it got to be, because of what we had going on, it was like probably 1 day to a week behind.
Oh, okay.
On average.
That's not bad, actually. That's not bad. But what was the rate of change like back then, in terms of the, I think weren't that many changes per batch, if I remember rightly.
No, it was. You could keep up with it. It was steady, but it wasn't. It was a handful of things per day, probably.
So you're also building and responsible for quite a few of the core packages. I mean, I've seen all of the build scripts. So I think PHP you did, Perl.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly some others. Obviously SGML-tools.
Apache. Yeah, I was doing a lot of that stuff too, and I can't remember. I can't remember all of them that I was doing, but at that point in time, Patrick still had the collection of different kernels, like different kernel configs. So updating the kernel was usually a long undertaking for him, and he had he would build them all, build all the module sets and stuff, and it was a very, very involved process. I tried to replicate that sort of model for Sun, but with fewer options. So I basically did it by, you had like the Sun 4C, Sun 4M, Sun 4U, and then there weren't a lot of peripherals. So I was like, well, okay. I'll just enable everything. It doesn't really matter. But at that time on Intel, if you turned everything on, you would have this gigantic kernel image loaded. But I think now
he's before kernel modules. So it was the monolithic kernel. So you'd end up with
we had modules, but it was before like an init RAM FS where you could like configure and load things. So a lot of times, even though we had modules in the kernel, it was just easier, or it only worked if you just compiled it in.
Many of them were like that. It's so funny because it's been so long since I would actually build something from, well, I was going to say build something from source. I do that pretty much every day. But in terms of figuring out what's new, when you look at read the README and say, okay, /configure, here are the options. It's been so long since I actually did that.
Yeah.
How did you go about doing? Did you just do that and go, okay, well, this is it, and just have several iterations, or did you kind of use something else as a reference? For example, with Apache when you were building that.
Well, yeah. So I think when I saw source trees that had a configure script, it was kind of a sigh of relief, because you knew, you could probably just brute force trial and error that and it would work. Something like Apache or something that just came with a makefile was gonna be more involved, because you knew it wasn't going to be the same as Intel. So you would look and see what was done there, and it's like, okay, this is what I have to do for SPARC, and then make your patches and stuff like that. So it was really just trial and error, just seeing how it builds and iterate over that many times, and eventually you get something that's reproducible. That really hasn't changed, I mean, that's still how we build stuff in Fedora and RHEL,
When I was at Red Hat, the system, they took me around into the big server room in the Raleigh campus. It's probably not there anymore because I think it moved, didn't it, years ago? But they took me in there, and the guy Nate was the IT guy at the time, and he's like, "Oh, this is Beehive. It's like a big Dell cabinet with all this server. Is this Beehive?" And I was like, "What's that?" He said, "Oh, this is what compiles all of the it was Red Hat. Was it Red Hat Linux at the time? Well, it certainly wasn't.
It would have been RHEL. Yeah.
Okay.
Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Because this is Beehive. It compiles everything. I'm like, oh, okay. It's not the case anymore, is it? It's a completely different system.
No. So I've been here for a while now.
20 years, David.
Yeah.
It's a while. That's half a lifetime.
Yeah, I know, right? But like I said, still to this day, I get asked more about my brief, by comparison, time at Slackware than I do about anything at Red Hat. But no, when I started, the build system was Beehive, and it was all the packages they were in CVS, and each package had its own repository, and each major release was a different branch in CVS. So like there was like a RHEL 3 branch and a RHEL 4 branch, and then we had FC branches for Fedora Core, and for certain things you would see RHL branches for the old Red Hat Linux, and that's how it was maintained. The CVS didn't store the source tarbles. Those were kept in we call it a look-aside cache, so it's just a big data store. And then the build system would fetch, like it would have like a checksum or like an MD5 sum or something, and it would say, go get this file, and then it would, well, while you're working on it, it would construct a source RPM and submit that to Beehive, and Beehive would take that source RPM and build it in the right environment.
Oh, okay. Did it work similar to how Debian do their Cheroots environments? So here's the dependencies. Only build it inside that mini.
Sort of. What Beehive failed to do was set up a clean environment for each build. What it did instead was, each time a build was done for, let's say, a RHEL 4, if that build succeeded, it would take the built RPMs and update the build environment used for the next RHEL 4 packages. So each build environment was a cheroot, but it was a full install. So things like build requires and stuff in the spec file weren't used. All that went away when we moved to Brew, which in Fedora is called Koji. Yeah. So that one, actually, you submit builds to it, and it actually uses mock to set up a clean cheroot and populates it with the build requires in the spec file. So it's
quite useful, actually. I look at sometimes the build logs from Koji for ARch64 sometimes to see how the guys at Red Hat have built something. If there's some particular flags or something they've used. Is there any kind of like major, particularly memorable events from your time working on Slackware?
Gosh, I think there were a number of things with the book. I remember we heard from multiple people that there were college classes and there were like community college classes that were using the book that we wrote as part of their teaching material or like required reading. And
Ooh.
I was really kind of surprised to hear that because we had no intention of it being a textbook. But everyone that we heard from said the way it was written makes it really usable in a classroom environment. So that was, kind of an unexpected thing that I guess we accidentally did, but we'll take credit for that, which was kind of cool. It was fun getting to go to all the different trade shows. It was really exhausting, but the company did travel us to New York and Las Vegas and all these different places, and it was kind of a fun time. It was when I was there. That was when Red Hat went public. VA Linux went public,
Oh, yes.
and it felt like each time we would go to one of these events, it was bigger and bigger, and you're like, wow, this is like a growing industry. And you would see new companies, but you would also see, companies that had been around for a long time. Like Sun would always have like a huge booth, and you're like, wow, okay, this is like for real. This is like, this is serious now. And of course, what I guess no one really saw or anything was that Linux was eroding the commercial Unix business. So those companies don't exist anymore. They came, they're like, yeah, this is great, and now they were rendered irrelevant, I guess. So I guess I'm thankful to be on the non-losing side of that. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot. Oh my gosh, what was the name of that? Oh, so there was one marketing thing that Walnut Creak had us do, which it just, I don't even know how we got roped into this thing, but there used to be a chain of ridiculous electronic stores in the US called Fry's Electronics. They went out of business a couple of years ago, but these things were huge, massive warehouses, and they would be full of computers, computer parts. They sold appliances, home stereos. I mean, it was just like these massive stores, and they had a huge software section. And what Fry's wanted to do is they were going to have a Linux day or whatever in their software section, and they wanted vendors to come in and give out freebies and answer questions and help move product in the store.
Okay.
Yeah, so we somehow get roped into this, and we're told, yeah, you'll be there, and all these other companies will be there too. So it'll be like kind of like a little mini trade show. And they wanted us to go to all the different Fry's in the Bay Area. And so we divided up. So I went to one store, Logan went to one store, Chris went to one, Patrick went to, I forget where. And we get to our respective stores. And in my case, there was only one other vendor that showed up. Most of the stores, it was just us that was there with this very sad folding table and nothing to give out. And we had to stand there for 8 hours and answer questions or listen to people just talk, and you couldn't go anywhere. And we were by ourselves, so we couldn't leave the table. Like, so we didn't have like a bathroom break or anything. I think I went anyway because I was like, I just can't. It's 8 hours. No one's here. I don't care. But yeah, the store I went to, the vendor that showed up was this company called Stormix, Storm IX. They were out of British Columbia, and they were basically a side hustle that some ISP in Vancouver had created, and they created Storm Linux, which was a attempt to commercialize Debian. Oh. And the guy who created it was the one who showed up at Fry's. And we talked for a while, and he was really cool, and we ended up, we'd meet up at different trade shows and stuff like that. But they had some stuff at Storm Linux, or they did stuff at Storm Linux that is now like standard Debian stuff, and like the knowledge of where that originated is just gone. And I always wonder what happened to this, what happened to the people that were working there and stuff. But yeah. And anyways, that was a weird marketing thing. After that, I think we said we are not doing the Fry's thing ever again. So just get that out of your head. And we got a few apologies, but otherwise it was like, well, that's just the business, so thanks for going. But
were you supposed to be there like with t-shirts or CDs or anything else, or
yeah, so Fry's was expecting us to show up with all the typical giveaways, like bring shirts, bring stuff, and just not software. They didn't want us to give that away. They wanted people to buy it in the store. And Walnut Creak didn't send us with anything. We're like, I don't.
So you literally were there with a sad table.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know why we're doing this. Like, what's the point? But yeah, it was really weird. It was definitely the weirdest like marketing thing that I ever had to do. The other companies chose correctly to just not show up. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure I could dig up more and more stories. Some that are probably not appropriate for a podcast, but
I'm sure.
Oh wait, you can edit it though.
I can.
Yeah. No, it was a fun time, and I have no regrets about taking that chance and being part of Slackware for a brief period where there was money for it. I have thought from time to time, because Patrick wanted us to continue working on it, even though there was not going to be pay anymore. And at that point in time, I was like, I felt like that would be really risky for myself, because I left university to go and do that with the intention of kind of finishing later. And now I was thinking, well, I've lost this job. Like we were laid off, and I don't have a degree. Is it really wise for me to keep investing all this time in Slackware right now? I think that's kind of too risky even for me. So I returned. I did try to find another job while I was out there. Oh yeah, this was good. So we were impacted by the .com bust. So every company that had sprouted in the last 6 months was laying off people left and right. So, and the companies that were still around had hiring freezes. So I tried to get in at Cisco. They had a hiring freeze. We had met some people who worked at B Incorporated. I don't know if you remember BOS.
Oh, BEOS.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I contacted one of the kernel guys I knew there. I was like, yeah, so, we're closing up shop here, and, SUSE just closed their North American office, and I guess we were next. And I was like, so you guys got any openings at B? And he was like, as a matter of fact, we do. We're hiring for, I forget, I think it was release engineer or something. I was like, can I send you a resume? So I did. They called me. They did a phone interview with me. It went really well. They're like, this is exactly, because the work I had been doing for Slackware was like directly applicable there. And they're like, we'd like you to come in. This was like a Tuesday or Wednesday. We did this phone interview. And they're like, so not everyone is here right now that we want you to meet. But let us work up the paperwork, and then you come in on Monday, and we can finalize everything. And you can meet the rest of the team, and all that. It was basically a verbal offer. And I was like, oh man, I actually found a position. This is great. It was in Menlo Park, and we were in the northern part of the bay, so I was going to have to move. But I was like, okay, I tell Chris and Logan, I'm like, I got a job. Logan had found a job. Chris was still looking. I was like, okay, I think I'm good, and told him all that. And then I think we go to watch TV or something, and this was the next day. So we're watching TV the next day, and the local news comes on, and it says something like Palm, the Palm Pilot Company. Yeah. At that point, were they with 3Com? Whoever Palm was buying B, and B was getting shut down, and they were basically buying it for the intellectual property. And that was like the day after I had this phone interview. And I remember just sitting there seeing that. And then, of course, I go back to my computer and I pull up Slashdot, and it's right there. It's like B is dead. And I was like, oh, my God. And I think I think we went out to get pizza or something. And I told Chris, I was like, I don't know about this. I think I'm going to go back to university and pick up there. And he's like, yeah, let's do that. So Logan had already moved for his job. It was down to me and Chris. So we rented a moving truck, loaded it up, and drove it back across the country and went back to university. Yeah.
You actually paused university to work on Slackware, is that right?
I did, yeah.
Ah, I didn't realize. Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Well, at least you finished it was in the end.
Yeah. I mean, it was one of those things that I wanted to take the opportunity while it existed, and I was like, I can transfer to another school, I can finish, so I didn't have a lot to finish, but I was like, this is kind of a thing I want to do, and my parents thought I was nuts. Obviously, they're like, oh my God, you're never gonna finish, and all this kind of stuff, but it ended up working out fine.
And you've been working at Red Hat for 20 years now, so
yeah, and
worked out well.
And Chris got to Red Hat before I did, and he referred me, so he's been here 21 years.
Oh, right. I didn't know that he was. I knew that you'd gone to Red Hat in the end, but I didn't realize that he had.
Yeah. He's still here.
Wow, crikey. We've almost spent 2 hours talking about this. I'm sure we could talk for more. I'm sure you've got plenty more stories, but I think we'll probably have to wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for asking me to do this. Happy to do these kinds of things and walk down memory lane. Some years ago, there was one of these local Linux fests things called the Southeast Linux Fest in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I went to that and gave a presentation on Slackware from the time period that I was in. And it became I think it became their most viewed video. And it was just me just like, kind of like talking about the stuff we were talking about, like how hard it was to configure X and stuff like that. So, I enjoyed doing that kind of stuff, sharing like, what things were like and how far we've come with everything we've, been able to develop and improve over the years.
It's amazing that Slackware still, I was going to say it's amazing that it still exists, but it's what Patrick does. He has an incredibly good memory. I've noticed for details. He has an incredibly good memory for details.
Yeah.
I asked him a couple of things. He remembers in quite some detail about certain things. But I think it's interesting though, because one of the things that I've got to say that I love about Slackware, and one of the things I noticed as soon as I started using it, was just the consistency across the entire OS. I'm sure RHELS or Red Hat, so you probably know this. You probably perhaps have the same thoughts or the same feelings. But to me, it's just because there's been one person that's maintained it for the entire duration of its existence, that knows how intimately how pretty much every part of it works. That it just has this sort of wholesome feel about it. That everything is kind of ticks over nicely and it's all cohesive in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, and
to
I
you.
think that that also is tied into Patrick's, policy of not constantly changing things unless there's a really good reason. Files find their place in the file system and they park themselves there, and so like the path you learned 20 years ago is probably still valid.
Yeah.
And there's not like setting up this GitHub action where I build my software in a Slackware environment. It was easy to get right back into it. Like, oh yeah, I remember all this. It's still the same. Whereas, yeah, like you look at major versions of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they're very different, across the board. And part of that is because we are seeking to drive change. We are, Red Hat wants to support new platforms, new technologies, and that kind of stuff. So it doesn't have the what's the right word here? It doesn't have the need to sort of like maintain that sort of consistency, I guess. I can't think of a better word. There is a thing I wish we would do in Fedora and RHEL that Sun was very good about doing in Solaris, is that as they would move things around the file system, they would keep symlinks in place.
Or pointing you, directing you.
But like commands, like on Solaris, the mount command in SunOS was initially in the etc directory.
Oh yes.
And then it found its way into SBin, but you can still run etc mount, and it's like little things like that allow easier upgrades and migrations and people to reuse their scripts. And we don't carry that same level of backwards compatibility in RHEL or Fedora. Certainly not Fedora.
No.
RHEL's a little better, but it could be improved.
Yeah, I remember when I was still working at Red Hat, and I'd have to do, say, the RHEL 4 to 5 upgrade on server. So I'd have to go and learn a whole bunch of new stuff.
Yeah.
Just to do an upgrade. I remember one of the guys, one of the finance guy actually, years ago, he said to me when I was in Ireland doing the upgrade in the server room, and he said because he said, well, what does this upgrade bring us? Like the probably sales question. What does this bring us? I'm like, I don't really know what to say. Well, not a lot. Not for what we're using it for anyway. We just upgrading it so we don't have to maintain several different versions of the same thing. But other than that, it's a file server and a print server, and that's pretty much what it does.
Yeah, it's like people ask me that too. With what's new, and I used to be able to like to me the big thing that we went all in on in RHEL 5 was IPv6 support and Zen virtualization.
Oh yes, Zen, yeah.
Which we bet the farm on that and lost. And then we're like, did we say Zen? We meant to say KVM.
It's still 3 letters. We just transposed them a little bit.
Yeah. Oops.
Then I remember.
Yeah. But out of that, we did get we got libvirt and virt manager and sort of that extrapolation layer. So the implementation underneath could change, but the commands would remain the same, which was nice.
Oh.
Virtualization. Now it's all containers, though.
That's all containers, yeah. So it's one of the things I've got to learn, Kubernetes. I need to get into that for some work stuff. I'll have to pick that up at some point.
Yeah, it's I'm still just in the OS stuff.
How are you?
Yeah. So for when I started at Red Hat, I was working on the installer team, so Anaconda. So if you installed Fedora or RHEL, or like from RHEL 5 forward, then that's an installer I worked on, and Fedora Core 4 and forward. and I don't work on the installer anymore. I have a lifetime of writing OS installers, and I don't want to do that again. But now I'm on the RPM and DNF team, so I work on the packaging tools.
Oh wow, okay. Do you find that any of your old kind of experience back in the day helps at all? I guess it's been so long.
I'm sure it does, but I can't think of specific things. I do at this point in time. I find myself pointing out, like someone will say, here we can do this, and I'm like, and it'll like fix a problem or something, and I want to jump in and say, we wanted to do that a long time ago, but it wasn't possible. Like, we knew we needed to do that, but it wasn't possible. So please don't call it a bug. It was something that we just couldn't technically do at that point in time. And I that comes up from time to time. So I think seeing code and working on these projects for so long has, it causes that, you start to remember all of those things, how it connects to what you're doing now.
Do you enjoy that? Because I used to enjoy that in my previous role, where I'd nothing to do with Linux though, but where somebody brings something up and you're like, yeah, we tried that 8 years ago and it doesn't work because of this. Maybe it will now. Like, you just let that
definitely
historical knowledge. It's kind of like I don't know what the word is to describe. It's not nostalgic. It's just more like, I guess it just shows you how far you've come and developed in.
Yeah. I like to point that stuff out. Just to show that, like, it didn't work at this point because of this, and this, but now we can do it. That's really cool. There are people that I work with who will do that. Like, we tried this 8 years ago and it didn't work. And instead of saying, maybe it'll work now, they say, so why wouldn't we try it again? We already tried this and it didn't work. So I know it's going to fail. I don't do that. Because that's just, you can't assume this stuff is static. It's always changing.
That's a good point. One of the things I was thinking about, what occurred to me recently, was that how is the endurance of the Slackware system. When I say Slackware, I mean the package tools and all that stuff, because it's all written in shell. And there's hardly been any, you can count on a few fingers the amount of time, not that I maintain package tools, but I see all of the changes. And so there's been only a handful of times over the entire duration of the project where you've had to actually, or Patrick really has had to go in and change the tools because the parameters changed, or one of the tools started complaining because it deprecated an old an old command line.
Right.
Whereas if it was, say, Anaconda or something, you'd have to rewrite it because the version of Python's been superseded by a new one, and you can't build it anymore. And
for us, it was oftentimes GTK was changing because we have the graphical installer in. So it's kind of opposite of what you would think. You would think having a really complicated shell script would be something that would require constant maintenance because of the changing UX, but
it doesn't.
It doesn't really happen like we think it would. I can, at least in the last year, I can think of one or two instances where a core command line tool that we use, like grep, I think started arguing.
Started complaining when you put it. Actually,
a backslash. You would escape
the backslash.
Yeah.
Start colon everything you thought you needed to. In fact, I was actually hacking on my build system today because Patrick had removed several packages, so my system just automates all of this stuff away. So it was saying grep. Blah, blah, blah. I was like, what? Oh, okay. I need to go and remove the backslash I thought I needed. And
right. Yeah.
then if you call grep without -e, it doesn't complain. So if you, but other than that, there's pretty much it. There's not a lot that you need to really maintain, actually.
Yeah, the other one I can think of, this goes back, I guess, several years now, but I think Gem Jim Myring with core utils modified the default quoting for ls.
Oh, yes. Right.
And I saw that and I was like, nope, I'm turning that right off. But
yeah,
if you think about it, like I think about a new user or someone who is not a heavy OS developer, let's say they're a developer, but they're working on like a web application or something like that, and they need to use the command line, but they don't, live at the command line. Having that quoting style be the default in ls now is probably better, because it does make it obvious where non-printable characters are.
Right. Okay.
But I don't like it. So I turn it off.
No, that's the kind of thing I see when I look at the build script diffs between, because I have my own ARM source tree, which I need for autonomous reasons. And then I look and I see my system just pumps out the diff. I'm like, it is like, no, we're not doing that. Patched out, gone.
Yeah.
Can't change these things. Well, listen, David, by the looks of it, we could probably talk all day. I imagine that there'll be quite a few people that watch this and remember you replying to their because there's still, in the Slackware community, there are people who've been around for longer than I have that use it, and probably remember you replying to their support questions and all of that.
Well, so, yeah, hopefully I was able to help them.
I'm sure you were, but I'm sure that if you're up for it again, if anyone's got any particular questions for you, they can let me know in the comments, and perhaps we can talk again.
Absolutely.
Really 2 hours and 5 minutes.
Hey,
6,
not
actually.
a problem.
And yeah, if you're able to find eventually, when you've got time, your old source trees and that kind of thing, I can get those for educational, historical purposes. We can put them on one of the Slackware mirror FTP sites. Yeah, I was really disappointed when I realised it had gone missing. I was asked Patrick, he goes, "No, I don't have any of that stuff," because I wanted to look at Proto Package and Auto Slack. So I remember those and the SPARC tree, but they've been long gone. So I'm really glad that you kept them.
Yeah. I wouldn't get rid of that stuff. It's just a matter of finding it now. And there's a couple more boxes that I need to go through, but I'll take what I have so far and post it. And I can put it on my FTP site, and then you can mirror it as well. And yeah, because I was joking initially when I was like, well, hold on, I don't know if I want the world looking at my old code like this. I mean, we're talking about stuff I haven't touched in over 20 years.
Oh, well over that, yeah.
Yeah, for
4 years, yeah.
For dead architectures, it's like not even applicable to anything. But I think it is important to have that historical stuff. One thing that we did get back when SourceForge was not so hostile, we had the guys at SourceForge actually gave us FTP access, and that was when they were running ftp.sourceforge.net. And Patrick and me and Chris all had shell accounts on that. And we also have shell accounts on ftp.cdrom.com, which I kind of wish that was still around. But they let us just host mirrors, download mirrors there. So they gave us these shell accounts and we could just rsync stuff to it. And we were like, how much space? And they're like, unlimited. And so Patrick put every version of Slackware up there. He's like, I've never been able to do this. And he dug them all up and put them up there. But then, of course, that site went, south. So, but he wanted it up there for, historical reasons too. It's like, people should see all these releases and that kind of stuff. And it's really kind of cool to have that.
And some people I've seen on YouTube, somebody installed Slackware on a 486 or I think on a real 486.
Yeah. It would be.
The installer still looks the same.
Right.
Good for ARM though, because when I originally started ARM, everything was done over the serial cable. It's only with ARch64 that you could actually use it at a monitor.
Right. Yeah. Oh man.
It's still the same install. Well, yeah, it's pretty much still the same installer. All right, David. Listen.
Okay.
You definitely could go on, but yeah, thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk again. Cheers, man. Take care. Bye.